And next we'll have Nancy Dreyer from IQVIA.
You can sense a theme today. You know, I wanted to bring you back up to the kind of the top of the high-level thinking here. So first of all, I'm an epidemiologist, and I'm a data generator, like Kathy. I work for a large CRO, and we have a variety of tools that we can use. But been living in the real-world data environment for a long, long time. And I think that we need to go back to the comments that Elliot Levy introduced this morning. How big an effect estimate are we looking for? Because that's kind of the crux, I think, of we need to ground this discussion in that context. If we're talking about chronic diseases, as Dr. Califf pointed out, and treatments that might make a small but important benefit, then we want to really look at the blinding issue and where it applies. But the question that Dr. Critchlow ended, how wrong can we be with real-world evidence, I think is really the first sets of questions that you want to think about. How big is the effect estimate, and how likely am I going to be to miss it? So the question about could patients' and physicians' expectations explain the observed effect, now then let's look at what kind of effects are we talking about. And I'd like to make the distinction between the subjective and the more objective measurements. If we're measuring your HbA1c, I don't think it matters what your perception is. The blood test is going to tell you an answer, and it's really not going to be affected by that. So there are a number of examples of outcomes. Pain is at the other end of the spectrum. There's good evidence to show that if you get that fancy box and that really expensive-looking product, you could be influenced by that in your perceptions. Not clear that's a durable response and that will persist beyond a short time. But that's why we lead to the question about how wrong could we be. So I wanted to just bring up two slides from some of the work that Jeff was talking about this morning that the Friends of Cancer showed last week. So here we had 6 data providers. 5 of them use electronic health records. 1 of them used claims data. And the dotted line here is a referent meta-analysis of trials. So here's time to treatment discontinuation, which is an imperfect metric because we understand that in cancer people are starting to treat beyond response and thinking that will make a difference. And so crude as this is, but the real world data and most, let's see, 5 of the 6 that used EHR, I think only 1 of them had the time to actually implement natural language processing to really dig into the EHR. The rest of them use readily accessible data that they could get their hands on. But the estimates are not so far wrong from what you saw in the trials. So this is an example of a relatively easy to measure outcome. When did you stop giving the treatment? And you can see the months, the duration doesn't particularly matter, but the variation, I think, from the trials is what's important. And this is the overall survival. And EHR and health insurance claims, but more so EHR, are not the best ways to find out if somebody died because they don't tend to come back in the office or have somebody call or drop dead in the office. But that said, look how close the estimates were to the error bars from the trials. So I think the questions we like to answer, and I don't speak for a regulator, I speak as a consumer and as an evidence generator. People want to be exactly right. And, they want to know if it's 5 months or 5.2 months. But what I want to know is the directionality and how much the benefit is. And if one says 5 months or 10 months and the other says 11 months, I have an idea of the benefit that the product could have. And I think we need to bring ourselves back up to the big picture of how much difference is important from the ideal and what do you want to pay for that. So the second point I wanted to also ask you to think about is the limitations of where blinding can practically be used. So we're talking about some great examples that we see. And I think where's an individual treatment that's pretty straightforward, we saw a vaccine, we see this lots of in drugs. It's conceivable to use blinding in those situations. But when we're talking about complex treatments, sequence combinations, oncology, treatments where individual monitoring of some parameters required to make dose adjustments, you don't want to harm the patient for the sake of doing a nice, neat study. So I think we see a tool that can be valuable in a narrow set of circumstances. So I want you to keep that in mind. Is this tool useful? How useful? And recognizing that I can't necessarily employ it widely. So, you can think about the value of doing sham surgeries and the like. And then I want you to think about what information we lose when blinding is employed. We talked about the diversity of patients who could be applicable and medical practices that can't store a drug and monitor it and manage it. There's also the likelihood that patients drop out when when they break the blind because they don't feel better, or they test their cholesterol somewhere at home and find out it didn't make a difference. And then I know this is not the main constraint, but I do like to think about the economic value of what you get for your investment. I mean, it does, as a public health person, it does matter how we spend our money and what information yields we get. And this is just a simple example of a small cardiovascular outcomes trial. And I had 3 different models of execution because I do work for a large CRO. Forget the classic model. Let's just look at the lightest touch that an R&D company can do, where it's still double-blind, placebo-controlled, very focused, modest source data verification, and everything according to the books of the SOPs appropriate for a randomized controlled trial. And then a real-world study where all I did was go open label, so no blinding, and comparators were standard of care, which really would mean you'd need a bigger trial. But the point is that it cut the budget in half. So I didn't get the 2/3, Elliot, that you got in your approximations, but half is big money, and this was a small cardiovascular outcomes trial. So I think to myself, as a consumer and as a person with a family, I want information about all these people not in the trials. And if you make it so difficult to generate information, or you have such a homogeneous population, it leaves the rest of us without information. So I'm in favor of more diversity because I can learn more for the expenditures. Anyway, thank you.